Thank you so much for coming to the LES conference and attending this session. Just so everybody knows where you are at the session titled Developing a New Energy Framework, Infrastructure and Consumers. My name is Melissa Elander. I work for Clean Energy New Hampshire as the North Country Energy Circuit Rider. And it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session. Sherrie Trefry is an energy market leader at VHB, working out of the Bedford, New Hampshire office. She's worked as an environmental scientist specializing in natural resource assessment and regulatory compliance for over 18 years. As an energy market leader, she focuses on clean energy clients developing solar and offshore wind projects, as well as utility clients working to upgrade and maintain reliable transmission systems. Sherrie is a lifelong New Hampshire resident and earned her undergraduate and graduate degrees at UNH. Sherrie currently serves on the board of Clean Energy New Hampshire. So Sherrie, I will turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to moderate this panel because as I was reviewing the presentations from our esteemed group of experts here, I realized I knew very little about this topic, and I'm looking forward to learning more today. We're going to start off with David Littel. He's an attorney and shareholder with Bernstein Shur with more than 30 years of experience in energy, utility, and environmental matters. A recognized national expert on integrating energy and environmental regulation in markets. David provides guidance to private and public clients, utilities, state officials, public utility commissions, environmental regulators, and energy officials on how to approach and resolve complex energy, utility, pollution, environmental, and economic problems and challenges. And I'll turn it over to you, David.
Thank you. I am looking forward to seeing the next two presentations. By the way, I'm here in my capacity as a senior advisor with the Regulatory Assistance Project, who is a nonprofit and also a client of my firm and my former employer. So this works, which is good. I am setting up the next two presentations, and the point here is we're talking about incentives, right? So the first observation, when I was in college, which it looks like maybe when a third of you were in college, behavioral economics wasn't a thing. Like, it was not a discipline, among other disciplines. So just to observe that, that the entire area of behavioral economics has grown relatively recently. And it's recognized as opposed to classical economics, which assumes that all consumers and companies, sellers and buyers are rational or essentially rational, right? They're not. I mean, customers behave in certain ways. They're sticky, operate in areas of imperfect information, and don't always make entirely rational decisions. So we know that now, and we're adjusting to it. But the area of utility regulation, in some regards, still is built on the model that was started over 100 years ago. And the information in New Hampshire goes back even farther than 100 years ago to when utility regulation started. So in proceedings I'm on, and I represent parties across the gamut. The only type of energy entity I don't represent is a coal generator or anyone that deals with coal. No coal. But other than that, we represent them, and I represent a utility. And we have parties hammering on us to do a marginal cost of service study, which is important. And having served on a commission, I know why it's important, but it's also very expensive, and it doesn't necessarily tell you what you need to know. So I'm happy to answer questions on that, but I won't dwell on that. You can do much more relevant, much better studies, such as figuring out how to deal with, this is your average household usage. This slide was actually produced somewhere out west where it's warmer, but this shows what you might get for peak usage in a residence, and this is about right given my own experience. I have solar panels on my roof, and when I've got all of the heat pumps going when it's really cold and I plugged in my EV, this is about what it looks like. And my daughter, who is now graduated from college, but when she was home, she would sneak in a heater because it had to be 90 degrees in her room, right? So I would then see something like this and go, what is the size of my service drop transformer? which that is not the primary concern. But if you add up all of these, a lot of people doing this with electrification, you can have issues with the bigger transformers that feed your feeder, right? And so you can save a lot of money by reducing peak in terms of system-wide usage, not to mention energy. And that's what rate design is all about. And we're going to have a presentation on very innovative rate design that some people are hammering me I should look at. So I'm looking forward to the presentation that you're doing. Transactive rates is sort of state of the art. So we'll hear about that. But this simply shows, this slide is from the Brattle Group, Ahmed Faruqi, who just retired, but he's not really retired, but he's still out there. And Sanam Sergici and some other very good people. And this simply takes all of the rate design work. They have their own internal database and shows how peak has been reduced across every time of use rate that's in place and every pilot that's been done. And without going through this in detail, this shows you that you can reduce your peak usage an awful lot simply by providing pricing to consumers. Again, and you can do even better with technology. And a lot of these early pilots were done with things like orange orbs that were put in people's houses that would glow and tell them that they could reduce their usage, right? We've got cell phones now. And in fact, I was sitting in the audience of the last panel I was in adjusting. I said, oh, I lost power at my house because all my lights popped on, turning them off. Oh, it's cold out at camp. I'll turn on the heat pump, you know? We've got technologies that allow us to do this. And I wanted to call this particular pilot that was done in Maryland to your attention, if you're not aware of it. I worked on this with the Maryland Commission and the Maryland utilities, all of whom actually agreed in a consensus basically what the pilot should look like. And the commission was so pleased with it, they are putting a version of these rates for each utility into place permanently. They already have peak time rebates, which is basically you get money back for reducing your peak usage in Maryland, but they're putting these time of use rates in place. The reason this study is significant is it shows sort of what we knew already from over 200 tests, that consumers will respond to well-designed rates. You'll often hear, and I have worked for the commission here in New Hampshire, for those of you that have bumped into me there, I know that you'll hear from some of your utilities, oh, our customers don't like time of use rates, they don't respond. To which I will respond, if I have the ability to do that, if you design a car with square wheels, consumers aren't going to like it, right? But if you design it well, and if it's workable for consumers, they'll like it. In addition, the significant thing of this study was it looked specifically at low and moderate income users. There is a myth out there that's very popular among, and it's too bad Don's not here, consumer advocates. Is anyone here from Don's staff? I've told Don this many times, but he still doesn't buy it. LMI customers will respond to low and moderate income to signals that are sent in almost the same proportion that your ordinary consumers will. And this study proved it. It had a separate study group for each utility, identified low and moderate income, and it showed that low and moderate income users who opt in are every bit as interested in saving money as non. Now, optional, this isn't mandatory, but it's a very significant study. So that's the setup for rate design, which is going to get a lot more complicated soon. I'll stop and ask if it's just a setup, but I'm not seeing anyone who wants to talk about it. We're going to talk a little bit more about the setup for incentives for utilities, known as performance-based regulation by some. Now, performance-based regulation generally takes an objective of the jurisdiction that's important and puts it into a regulatory form that encourages the regulated entity, utilities here, to operate in a certain way. And you can attach a financial incentive to it, positive or negative, and that's commonly done, and those are often called PIMs. So I'm going to lead you through this, which if you're listening to it, it will sound kind of like common sense, but it's not, because most people, most stakeholder groups, most commissions jump immediately to the last step. So your first step is defining what your goals really should be. And oftentimes that'll be done in legislation, and since we're in New Hampshire, it would be to save costs, right? That's in every jurisdiction, they want to save costs and save money. But that can be one. And indeed, there are years of early PBR plans that were designed around saving costs as multi-year rate plans. The next step, but it can be to establish energy efficiency or electrification goals or EV adoption or greenhouse gas reductions but establishing that goal with some amount of specificity is important. And I would also posit that it's important that there be sort of a big stakeholder political consensus around it. Because it's generally not healthy if you have one party that comes in and wipes out everything the next party did and whiplashes ratepayers in this direction and then the other direction. So the goal definition is important. The next step is to establish performance criteria, which I like to use the word performance criteria because it tells you what they are. Some people think of them as targets, but it tells you directionally where you want to go. And ideally, you're going to do it in some form that's quantitative. That's not always possible, but ideally, you're going to do it there, and ideally, you're going to use some type of standard measurement. But again, that's not always possible when we're talking about innovative new things. And then finally, you get to the metrics. But most people jump right to the metrics and like, this would be great. And they talk about what these formulas should look like. But there are many different ways to measure things, right? Even peak reduction that I referred to before. I can rattle off 10 different ways to measure peak reduction. And exactly how you're going to measure it's going to be dictated by exactly what you're doing. So we're in ISO New England. If we want to save money on our capacity payments, then it's going to be peak reductions measured exactly the way the ISO does it. If we want to save money on our transmission, it's going to be measured with a different metric, but those are all served up for us. We don't have any choice because they're dictated by ISO New England and NEPOOL. Those are two different measures. If we're at a local area, we're going to look at our local system peak, which is going to be different than the New England peak. And if we're really focused on trying to save money for the distribution system, we might decide to look at your circuit by circuit peaks, because if you want to save money on a certain set of substation investments, which are going to be some of your or feeder replacements, you can identify specific circuits where you want to do that. So you're much more interested in those circuits that are not going to have the same peak as any of the other peaks that I talked about. And in fact, Vermont does this with their energy efficiency program. They target certain circuits for energy efficiency investments, particularly for that reason. So again, I just use peak to say it matters what you're trying to do, and you got to relate it back to the performance criteria and the goal. Exactly how are you trying to save money, or how are you trying to integrate renewables into the circuit by managing your peak there so that you don't have to upgrade the substation. That'll lead you to sort of different ways and different solutions. So I just already talked about some of this. I'm not going to dwell on this, except to say that energy efficiency, that's an area that we haven't thought of it that way, but we've done performance incentives for years. And in fact, in New Hampshire, under your energy efficiency resource standard, your EERS, the utilities get payments for hitting certain targets that are set by the commission each year. That's a PIM. You've done it for years. Not unusual. And there are sort of different versions of PBR. You could call just going through the steps that I just talked about and doing reporting only metrics in something like a scorecard or on a website or to the commission in a report as PBR light, because you're not attaching anything to it. But people, when you grade people, oftentimes they tend to react just to that alone. There's something that's not done in the US a lot, in part because our metrics aren't comparable across jurisdictions, which is a real problem. Happy to talk about that. But in Europe, particularly Denmark, but also in the UK, they make them the same, and then they rank their utilities. They call them DSOs, slightly different creature, but they actually rank them, top to bottom. How are you doing on these efficiency criteria? So that's sort of a next form, not often done here. And the last form is attaching financial incentives to it. Rio, by the way, is the UK. Massive. So I am going to finish up with just two state examples of what I call the modern forms of PBR, the activity that's going on across jurisdictions now, leading jurisdictions. And there are a lot of them, but I picked two. One is Hawaii. Hawaii has gone all in for PBR, and they did it a number of years ago. They actually had legislation that mandated that it be done. And why have they done that? Well, they did it because their price of power was very high long before the price in the lower 48 became high. And we're still not where, and we never will be where Hawaii is. Because they're an island, they use fossil fuels to generate most of their electricity. Last I checked, they were at 31 cents a kilowatt hour, and I'm quite sure they're above that now. I just haven't checked. So they have gone in all out that they want to, instead of following the traditional regulatory cost of service model, they want to incentivize their utilities and pay them based on how they do for serving their customers and hitting certain metrics that include environmental performance metrics, renewable deployment metrics, and they've gotten quite sophisticated in Hawaii about how they measure it. Massive undertaking that they're still in the middle of in multiple phases in Hawaii. And this just gives you some sense for how to do it. And this slide nicely categorizes it. Yeah, we've traditionally done some of this stuff, right? I mean, for reliability, we've always measured CAIDI and SAIFI, albeit, again, not the same across utilities and jurisdictions, which is a real problem, to repeat myself, if you're not getting the point. But because when I was on the Maine Commission, right, I wanted to know how our utilities were competing, how do they stack up against other utilities? You can't really get an answer to that if you're measuring things differently. It's frustrating. And so reliability we've always done, but how do you measure an EV deployment? Do you do it number of EVs? Do you do it number of EV miles driven? Do you do it electricity charge? Do you do greenhouse gas saved from that? There are a number of ways to do it, and there's not a set way to do that yet. Happy to talk about any of this. And this gives you a sense for how they're setting it up in Hawaii. So revenue adjustment mechanisms, that's a general term for a positive or negative incentive. Negative incentives, some people refer to as penalties. Some people just call them negative incentives, particularly if your statute doesn't allow you to apply penalties. You tend to call them a negative incentive then, from experience. And then scorecards, so very extensive system in Hawaii. I don't think we'll be there anytime soon in New Hampshire or any of the states, but we have an example close, but it is good to know it's happening in a US state, right? Because I'm sure your legislature is like our legislature in Maine. Like, I will tell you a story that's true. I was with a different firm before Bernstein, and one of my former partners came in to lobby me on something when I was the environmental commissioner there. And we chit-chatted for 10 minutes, and he said, David, they're doing this in California. And I said, yeah, actually, they're not doing as much as we're doing in Maine. I said, what else do you have? And he kind of looked at me dumbfounded, like, usually that's all it takes, right? Well, they're doing this in Europe, right? So it's good to know US states are doing some things. And in Rhode Island, worked on a settlement down there for years with a large group of stakeholders. It was ultimately proposed to the commission by their division. They have a sort of different setup there. Their division is their energy office. Well, actually, it's not as different as it used to be from New Hampshire. But is there a consumer advocate, and they have a separate energy office, but worked on a very substantial settlement of a rate case for National Grid, right? Same utility for all of Rhode Island, for those of you that don't know Rhode Island, both on the gas and electric side, so that's simple. And the commission actually rejected it. All 23 parties were on board, no objectors, and the commission said, nah, this is too complicated, there are too many incentives, we're not sure that you can hit all of them. That shows the difficulty, but I think it's a healthy thing to think that the reason they rejected it is they weren't quite sure they got the details right. And the details matter a lot, because you don't want to give away money unnecessarily. I can think of several jurisdictions that are on the precipice of doing that right now. But you don't want to set it too low and just give away money, right, for things that the utilities are already going to achieve. Although I guess some might argue that point. But you also don't want to set it so high that it's pie in the sky that they don't bother to try. So you need to set it in a realistic area, and an area ideally where the benefits to consumers of the utility hitting that number exceed the costs that you're going to pay them, right? Pretty simple. And the Rhode Island Commission just wasn't convinced that the settlement, even with all the parties on board, got there. So they did, however, say we're interested enough in the metrics that I put on the board to have you report back on those. And that's because we might establish an incentive in the future. So grid, report back on those. That was the installed capacity. The CO2 that was saved through EVs, so that's how they decided to measure EV deployment, was in the CO2 that was actually avoided. Easy ways to do that. That's what Synapse recommended, by the way. Synapse likes that. I actually prefer a slightly different metric, but that's what the commission adopted. They want to look at fleet electrification and low-income measures specifically, as well as multi-unit EV deployments, which Connecticut's the real leader there, by the way. But that's what they wanted to measure, and how they're doing on DG interconnection, which is actually a really hard thing to measure, right? And it's really hard to measure for a simple reason. Like, wait, you think it's very easy. Just look at the number of DG applications that are approved. Well, if you incentivize the utility to process and get through a certain number of applications beginning to end in a certain time period, what do I do if I'm the utility? I actually regulate those, right? I sit in the form of a regulator, and if you give me a time period, I'll deny a certain number, right? And then I'll hit my target and I'll get the incentive. So you don't want to do that. So when you realize, that's why you have to sort of think through these things and always think, well, how can this be gamed? How does it really work in the real world? And you have to know how that works. So all of these were tracking metrics, but the one metric that was accepted in Rhode Island is, informative, I think, to how it should be done and how it can be done, is that they established what they call a system efficiency metric, but it was really just a peak reduction metric, and was pegged entirely off capacity market savings, right? Because in New England, if you work in the wholesale market area, you're very familiar with every energy consulting firm. I'm sure VHB has a section that will tell you what we're projecting for capacity market savings and what the prices will be in the future, right? They're always wrong, but we're so familiar with it, we're comfortable with it. And there's a lesson there, right? You just have to be familiar with how to measure it. You don't have to be sure that you're going to be right projecting into the future. So they said, okay, we know how to do this, and we know how to set this up in a way that works for both the utilities and for the customers. And they were very big about not wanting to double count things in Rhode Island, this commission and this I consulted with them. Unlike, say, Massachusetts, where they're perfectly fine with double counting, like, fine, we'll fund it through energy efficiency and we'll let you count it over here. So a different regulatory approach. So they separated out everything that was already funded under a program and said, these additional things will let you count for actual peak reductions. And then we will apply that to the capacity market pricing at the time. So even though the projections into the future are wrong, we're going to take the current prices, which we know we'll have, because those are set 3 years ahead of time. And we will let you make a filing for your peak reductions that you achieved each year. And you, National Grid, once we verify that, will get 45% of those savings. So by default, then 55% goes to customers, right? That's the way it'll work. Very simple. It works. And you know what? It has worked. I've reviewed the compliance filings. It's a beautiful sort of geeky thing if you love regulatory policy, which illustrates the challenge here. So with that, I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists, and we'll do all questions at the end, right? Okay. So who's next?
Thank you very much, David, for setting us up with a basic understanding that PBR is not just a beer. So, thanks for that. Next up is Erica Menard. She's the Director of Rates and Regulatory Affairs at Liberty Utilities and leads all rate making and regulatory activity for Liberty's electric and gas companies in New Hampshire. Erica has over 25 years of experience in the energy industry, serving in a variety of capacities, including financial planning and analysis, load forecasting and rates, and regulatory. She is excited about the opportunity to share Liberty Utilities' approach to alternative regulation in New Hampshire. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Dave, for setting this up. I wanted to talk a little bit about Liberty and our approach to what Dave just talked about in implementing performance-based rate making in New Hampshire. And so I wanted to first start out, so Liberty Utilities serves both electric and gas customers throughout New Hampshire. On the gas side, we have about 100,000 customers serving the Nashua, Manchester, Concord, Tilton area, and also Keene. And on the electric side, we have about 46,000 customers in the Salem area, Hanover, Lebanon, and Walpole area. And so we had our last electric rate case back in 2019-2020 timeframe, and when you have a rate case, there's outcomes that ultimately, we settled our rate case. And in our settlement agreement, we decided that we would pursue a performance-based rate-making approach in our next rate case. And we would work with stakeholders to design a framework and also design a roadmap to advanced rate-making. So, as Dave talked about, this exists in many states throughout the country. Here in New Hampshire, it doesn't. And there isn't a particular policy or legislative mandate to do this. This was really something that came out of our rate case with our stakeholders. So why are we doing it? Well, ultimately the goal is to achieve public policy and also lower rates for customers. And so I want to just briefly talk about our approach. We are still very much in the early design phases. We are planning a rate case next year, and we are in the stage where we're talking with our stakeholders, talking internally about how we want to approach PBR and what that means for Liberty. There isn't a standard definition of PBR. It's sort of like a Chinese menu. You can pick and choose what you want to do, and that's what we are in the phases of at Liberty. So I just have a little graphic that will kind of keep me on track. The way that we are approaching performance-based rate making at Liberty is really 3 different components. The first, as Dave talked about, is PIMs, performance incentive metrics. And these are, as we heard, can be a variety of different things. There's traditional utility speak, reliability-based, safety, customer satisfaction type measures. But then there's also more innovative type approaches. It's closely related to policy or emerging goals. And so that's where we have been kind of challenging ourselves to think about where can we create savings for our customers and also align ourselves with the state policy goals. And as you may or may not be aware, the state just issued a 10-year energy strategy. In that strategy, there are discussions about electric vehicles, about transmission, a variety of different topics. And so we're taking that in and trying to develop some performance metrics that align with those goals and also align with our core business. So we are focusing on what can we do with electric vehicles for Liberty's customers in New Hampshire. What can we do related to distributed energy resource interconnections? So a variety of things that we are thinking about. And so these performance metrics that we are considering have a policy goal in mind, have a target associated with them. We in the utility space love to measure things. We have scorecards, we have metrics, we have data. And so it's really taking that in and saying, we're going to put a line in a stake in the ground, and we're going to measure ourselves against that. And if we achieve that or exceed it, then we should receive some sort of incentive of it. If we don't achieve that, then the alternative is a penalty, or I forget the term you called it, but reverse incentive or negative incentive. There you go. So we'll have some policy goals, targets, some initiatives around that, because we need to determine how we're going to achieve these performance metrics. And then, the metric itself, how we're going to measure it, needs to be clear, well-defined, and then the incentive associated with it, which should closely align the risk with the reward. The next component that we are planning to include in our plan is a multi-year rate plan. And this is just a fancy term we've had this in New Hampshire actually for a number of years, where between our rate cases, we have these stair steps where we come in and we say, we've made all this investment, we want to recover some of that investment between our rate case time period. So there's a period of time, whether it's 3 to 5 years, where we won't go in for another rate case, but there's these little steps in between where we review the investments that we've made and measure ourselves against our forecast. And then finally, there's the earnings sharing mechanism. So if we achieve certain performance measures. If we achieve a certain goals, there's a sharing associated with that. If we overachieve, there's a sharing with customers. If we way overachieve, it goes all back to customers. So it's a balance, and it's really the ultimate goal is to provide savings to our customers. And so we, like I said, we're talking right now internally. One of the biggest challenges for us is we're sort of out in front. There isn't a legislative mandate to do this. We are doing this because we've agreed to this with our stakeholders in our last settlement agreement. We think it's a good thing for New Hampshire, but it's going to be a challenge to propose this. It's something new and different. We don't have a framework for it in New Hampshire, although the energy efficiency program is very similar, but it will be new in terms of the pure distribution side of things. So there's a lot of education that will go into this. I've had to educate internally within my own management team because it's risky. It's new and different. Why are we straying from our traditional cost of service approach? Well, what do you mean? There's risk associated with this. We want the reward, but we don't want the risk. So that those are the things that we have been struggling with internally. How to educate ourselves, how to design a well-designed performance plan, engaging with our stakeholders who have a variety of different outcomes that they want to see out of this, and then ultimately bringing it all together and presenting it to the commission, educating the commission, and then putting forward a plan to get this approved and then execute on that going forward. So we have a lot of challenges ahead, but we are definitely excited about this. Liberty is a smaller company than some of the other utilities in New Hampshire, so we're willing to be the first one out there and create something well designed, and then hopefully set the stage for the future for New Hampshire. So I'm happy to take any questions, but I'll turn it over to Brian next. Okay.
Thank you so much, Erica. Next, we will hear from Brian Callnan. He is the Vice President of Power Resources and Access for New Hampshire Electric Co-op. He is responsible for managing the Cooperative's power resource portfolio strategy. Brian began his career in 2003 as a resource planning analyst at Burlington Electric Department with a focus on energy efficiency, valuation, and systems design, before he moved to the Vermont Public Power Supply Authority, which is a joint action agency of 12 Vermont municipal electric systems. He became the director of the power supply and transmission part of the organization in 2010, and was responsible for all aspects of power supply and transmission, including representation of public power in municipal government, the state of Vermont, and the ISO New England stakeholder process. Please welcome Brian.
Thanks very much for that. Okay. For some of you, any co-op members here? Aha, we got one. Awesome. Oh, two. And for folks that were here last year, this might be a bit of a repeat, but there are some new ones in here, and so I hope it's interesting. So I wanted to walk through why are we doing this. It's a cooperative strategic planning goal, and then what is it? We're calling it a transactive energy rate, and we put pilot on the end of that because it's new. We're trying it out. And then why did this strategic planning goal come about, and why did we choose a transactive energy rate? It's about the members. We're a cooperative, nonprofit, so if we can't bring member benefit, we probably shouldn't be doing it. So that's why this came about. I put this quote up here. I don't know this guy, Michael, from Volkswagen. Volkswagen's a fairly big company, and I haven't checked to see if he's accurate or not, so don't check me on all that. But he's got in here, he says that the amount of cars that they're going to have out there is going to be more energy than's currently in with all the hydroelectric power in the world. Even if he's half wrong, that's quite a bit of juice out there. So that's pretty interesting, and it makes us kind of agree that auto manufacturers that have all these batteries running around on the roads are probably going to be doing something in the energy space. So here's who we are, and I was glad Erica talked about it because it's always, who's the second biggest utility in the state is kind of fuzzy for me, so I'm going to go off the numbers. So we've got about 80,000 members, and I heard Erica say about 46,000 electric members, so I feel good about saying second there. We are the biggest distribution cooperative, though, in New England, and we are in the ISO New England market. We do participate actively there, and then there's a map of where our service territory is there. So we're all over the place. We actually have one of our board members here today, but our rates are not going through. We don't go to the PUC for our rates. Our 11-member elected board approves our member rates, which allows them to do some of these strategic plans and come up with different designs. So what were we talking about when I said a strategic plan goal? There's 2 different years here, 2017 and 2019. So the strategic plan I was talking about here was a recognition that our members are going to want to connect to the system in a different way, maybe at increasing rates, but we don't know what those rates might be. Widespread member adoption of DER is in there, or distributed energy resources is in there quite a bit. So in 2017, it was just highlighted that we want to be able to have a transactive energy business model. But there's a lot of definitions for what that could be. So 2019, we came back and we tried to put a little bit more fine, kind of explain it a little bit more. And we ended up with pricing signals. And by using pricing signals in order for people to transact with utility. And members have been transacting with utilities ever since we've been around. So this is something that we think can work. And the other part that was important about it is that it has to be scalable, and it also has to be able to work regardless of how often or how fast people want to use it. So here's another timeline. I like timelines because it just helps talk about how much work you've done in the past on it. But we are in this one, kind of the 2023 area, 21, 2022. We've developed all the elements that are needed for this program, and we're hoping to launch it in the first quarter of 2023. This I stole from a software developer that we hired to help build it, because they did a lot better job explaining it than we did. And this is how the rate works. When we talk about a device, I'll pick on a car, or no, let's pick on a battery, a standalone battery within a garage. A cooperative member can call up and say, I want to be on your transactive energy rate, and I know that this battery can talk to you guys, so I'm interested in doing that. So they call us up and they register the actual device. They don't register their meter, they register the device. And I'll get to that a little bit later. The co-op then steps in and will provide a price for any member to respond to. And that price is made up of costs that we will be paying anyway from other services. So why not just pay the member instead of paying ISO New England or Shell Energy or Eversource or somebody else? Green Mountain Power, we have to pay them once in a while. So we stack up a lot of costs that we know we're going to have, because we have a really good idea of what our costs are for the next day, and we publish that rate for folks. I'll show you an example of the rate in a minute. That battery can then respond to it by saying, oh, I know what the rates are for tomorrow, so I'll try to maximize what my battery can do. If I want to charge the battery, because I worked on this yesterday, I emptied it yesterday and I want to recharge it, I'll pick those hours that are the cheapest hours in that day and charge that battery. And hopefully they're in the morning, because in the afternoon I see that there's a price signal that says energy's worth a lot more. So if I discharge my battery, I can get paid, and then that's the arbitrage that I think David was talking about earlier. And you can do that day in, day out, day in, day out. And then the other part is, it's not an incentive-based system. We just see that as usage or export on the member's account, because that just looks like another meter to us. And that means we put it into our billing system, and it's all done, it's all automated because it all fits. And we're able to print a bill and send you the credits or send you the charges for it. So relatively seamless to get the value back to the member. But notice there's no aggregator part in here, which is an important part of this, but the money is going directly to the member. So if the aggregator wants to participate, there has to be a different way to receive the benefit or to pay for those services, maybe a subscription or something like that. The utility doesn't pay the aggregator, is my point. Here's a fairly busy table, but I'm not sure if there we go. Yeah. So the cheapest, this is a test day, January 21st, 2019. All this is trying to show is that there's 24 different prices. So this is time of use, but it's like time of use on steroids because it's 24 separate hours that have different prices. So in this example, this person had a couple Tesla Powerwalls in their garage, and they decided to charge on the cheapest hours here between 2 and 5 in the morning, and then discharge their vehicles their battery between 5 and 8. And they did that, and they made $2.20. That's something. It's not a lot, but these numbers can change a lot. Those can get into the dollar range or higher. So you can get much larger incentives for doing that. And this is where we've got why would you bother doing it? So I've got a few examples. I won't go through all of these. But when we look at the home battery example, if you were to maximize the value of that battery based on 5 kilowatts, 13.5 kilowatt hours, that's one single Tesla battery, roughly $1,100 a year. Now those batteries are expensive, but $1,100 a year for responding to that while still having the benefit of keeping your house running if there's an outage helps pay down that investment. So we see that as kind of a fairly nice member benefit. Now this is where it gets really interesting, is with electric vehicles, and there's an example I'll show you on the next slide on it. But you can use this for just managed charging, which is V1G. I don't know why they call it V1G, but it's just one direction. So you're just charging your car. But you can do the same thing you did on this other one and just charge your car at the times when it's the cheapest hours, right? We all know that it's already cheaper to fuel your car with electricity. This helps try to make it a little bit less expensive. And so when you do that, you're getting down to a cost for driving 13,000 miles. So this is a Nissan Leaf. That's the size of a Nissan Leaf battery. They drove around 13,000 miles, and they spent $400 to fuel that car. That doesn't sound like a lot today, but that's because when you compare it to what you would have spent on a gasoline, it's a significant difference. So that's a money in the pocket of the member from managed charging. And when you go to vehicle to grid, you kind of stack benefits there. So you're getting cheaper fuel to drive your 13,000 miles. But when you compare it, you're actually getting a net credit. You're not paying $400 a year. You're actually going to be getting a net credit. Now, these are all ideas, or these are all ranges of values that you could see. So what we did is we ran this rate backwards and said, what would the rate have been 2-3 years ago? And then we said, optimize that, and what do you get for a value for? So none of this is guaranteed. You'd actually have to watch the rate or have someone watch the rate for you to optimize your vehicle. The point of it, though, is to talk about that it gets to be fairly significant. Vehicles do one thing really well, or pretty well, is they get you from one place to another, and that's their primary purpose. What they don't do very well is keep money in your pockets. There's a lot of expenses when it comes to vehicles. And in this example, that vehicle actually turns into like a family asset. It's actually helping to return value to the family rather than a cost. And you can also hook up PV systems or PV with battery. We think that would be the more likely one is there, but other examples. So this was exciting. We have a fantastic member. All our members are fantastic, by the way, but this one is the Plymouth State University. They were really excited to do this. They went and they said, hey, we'll sign up, test. Why don't you test on us? Which that's fantastic for a utility that's trying new things because not everything's going to work right. And Plymouth State was very excited about it because they turned it into a project. They're a learning institution, so they've got some folks that got together and figured out how would they make the car look if they wrapped it. So they went to the marketing folks. They brought it to their business students, so they have like a business plan that they pulled together to show on it. The engineering folks were very interested in the technology, so it really worked for Plymouth State, and we really thank them for trying this out. We found a bidirectional charger for them. The company is called Fermata Energy. They're fully integrated, and we're talking to this car, or this car is seeing signals from the co-op since July of this year. Fermata Energy is intercepting those signals on behalf of Plymouth State, and then telling their charger. They say if the car is connected and the car is meeting its user preferences, right? Like I always want 20 miles to get to the hospital. There's a great hospital right in Plymouth, so you probably only need 5 miles there, but if you want to go to the mall, maybe that's another example, I don't know. But you can always leave a certain amount of energy in the car, and the charger knows that. But if it's plugged in, it's going to follow the schedule that these guys came up with the day before. And when they do that, because these are so large, so we talked earlier, it was a Nissan Leaf at 6 kW, almost 7 kW. These ones are 20 kW. That's a lot of energy. So when you have more energy that you can participate on those particular hours, your revenue can go up or your costs can go up too, right? Because you're using more energy. But when we do the math for these guys, and this is actually proving out pretty well, that's about $4,000 a year per car. That's a lot of money. Now these chargers are quite expensive, but they are literally the only UL listed chargers in the U.S. And this is the first. I have a picture of it. This is the first bidirectional charger in New Hampshire. So on the first two months or so that we've been looking at this, they've been able to bring in about $900 worth of revenue. So it's starting to prove out that that's actually going to happen. And then here's what that bidirectional charger looks like. Kind of simple, not humongous. Sitting there up on a wall. This one is quite expensive. This is what Ford's looks like, and that's Ford Lightning that you remember from the video, the commercials, during the Super Bowl and all that. Theirs is relatively inexpensive. $1,300 is a lot, but if you have almost 20 kW of going back and forth, 80 amps, you can start to see similar revenues that you saw on there. Now, I have not looked into all the specifics of this charger, so I'm just going off of the 80 amps on. I'm not sure if it can go the other way, that high or not. But the point being is it's affordable. That is all I had. The part that's been quite exciting about how this project worked is it. Dave said it sounds like it might be very difficult or complicated. I think complicated was the word that was used. There's a lot of boxes that are happening here. The blue boxes are what the co-op is doing. The green is what, in this case, the aggregator is doing. And then here's what the member's doing. Member's not doing as much. And that's by design. It's, let's have it kind of flow through and make it easy to use, otherwise no one's going to use it. But we have the whole process going, and that is the transactive energy rate pilot. And for those 2 members that are in the audience, hope to see that in the first quarter. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So I'm going to start off with a little poll. So who has devices in their home that control their heat or lighting from their phone? All right. And keep your hands up. So would you put your other hand up if you would control those devices based on information you were getting on your electric rate? All right. All right, so you can put your hands down. So for everybody, who would like more control over their power based on information? That's pretty much everybody in the room. So please give a big round of applause for panelists.